So without further ado, let me invite the keynote speaker, Paul McNally, before we get down to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. There's been lots of talk of AI, as there is usual in a conference like this. And I don't want to enrage anyone. I come in peace. That is my starting gambit. My name is Paul McNally. I run an AI consultancy based in Cape Town and have worked now with hundreds of newsrooms around the world to help them implement AI ethically. Part of that is prototype building, part of that is governance. And increasingly, newsrooms are under strain. They're also becoming more familiar with AI. And the big challenge now is making sure newsrooms don't not use AI, but use it ethically, basically to figure out, especially their most junior staff, how they can use it responsibly as well. So the original mantra of AI was this idea that you won't lose your job to AI, you will lose your job to someone who uses AI well, right? That was sort of 2 years ago, and that is definitely not the truth, okay? It is a fraction of the truth, but it is not the truth, okay? So last week, Apple announced that their Mac Mini, their tiny little computers, are in a global shortage, quite proudly. And one of the reasons for this is that people are starting to buy them up to run AI agents on these Mac Minis, right? They're putting them in the corner of their offices, their newsrooms, just their houses, and they're running AI agents now that are they're giving them tasks and getting them to do something beyond the chatbot that we're probably familiar with, something beyond ChatGPT, okay? So OpenClaw was the AI agent that they put on here. Unfortunately, the head of OpenClaw was then promptly employed by OpenAI. So this was an open source agent that people were putting on these Mac Minis, and OpenAI scooped in and basically poached the guy who had started this open source project. But it was a small win for the idea that we want progress in the terms of taking control of these AI systems. And that's something that I kind of come to you today with, is we are used to AI and tech platforms and these things being linked together, I think because of the history with social media. But I'm trying to push for this idea that we want to utilize some of this AI, but also try and pull it back as much as we can from these big tech platforms in a way that is feasible and affordable. Okay, so for newsrooms, taking control of these AI systems, it can lower top costs. If it's done well, it can also improve their data security. And hopefully, and this is the big one that I can see everyone has on their mind, is this idea of leading to monetization. Okay, so if you are to run through the workflow of a newsroom, you basically want to start with the news gathering, right? That's like going out into the world, finding a story, finding a reputable source, okay? Or just sitting at your desk and having ideas. And the thing that I have found kind of most disturbing is that that is the part that most newsrooms are pushing onto AI, right? This idea of idea generation. And I would suggest that you leave that uncontaminated by AI. We're going to go through a whole lot of the newsroom workflow, and I would say that everything else apart from this, you can start to automate in some sort of way. But this idea of generating ideas, generating story, thoughts, finding sources, going out into the world, I would leave uncontaminated by AI. You can build archive systems. I'm sure people in this room have already done that can generate ideas that pull from past successful stories. I did it recently with my newsletter, basically lurched into all my past newsletters and suggested ideas that were the most clicked, right? That seems like a great asset for editorial staff, but really it is something that you're kind of wading into the past. You're not pushing into the future. So this idea of idea generation, where 90% of newsrooms are using AI for that, I would suggest you park that and give that back to your reporters, right? But after having this original idea or discovering the reputable source, basically automation can operate at almost every other level of media creation. And instead of being scared of this, I would embrace this and feverishly reallocate everyone's time into news gathering, right? And monitoring the AI process, right? You can cancel some of these Adobe subscriptions and use it to buy fuel to put in the company car to send more people out into the world, right? And the next step in the value chain of newsrooms is, say, researching the topic that you've had this idea about. The next, pulling in vast data to analyze and speak to the macro of an issue, creating graphs and charts to display that. You can find industry experts to interview. All these things now can be automated to a certain extent, right? You can bring AI for all these sorts of steps, right? And the more that you automate that, the more you can start, and you've heard people say this again and again, you can start pushing your resources into the places where AI will not reach. Instead of doing what that idea of just doing everything faster, doing everything more, you want to find the gaps that are there and push people into those spaces that are not going to be able to get automated. Even though people would argue eventually everything will get automated, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so now when you're building an AI workflow, initially, I would suggest that you buy the tools, right? You pay the subscriptions, you bite the bullet, you start to use them and make notes. And meanwhile, you build this AI computer box, right? Someone used the word tech stack earlier. I'm not going to use that word, but you build this AI box in the corner of the room, and you start to think about how can you bring some of these subscriptions and processes that you're automating, like the ones that I just outlined, how do you start doing them in-house, right? And by and large, they will maybe not be as good as some of the paid tools, but they will be often free, right? So what you're trying to do is you're taking your whole newsroom workflow, you're trying to automate it with the paid versions, testing to see what works. And then over time, you're replacing some of those paid subs with things that you control, they can run in your office, and they can be relatively cheap or free, right? So these free modules in your tech stack, they might not work well enough, and that's where collaboration can kind of come on board. So already you're seeing newsrooms globally who are flagging parts, say language translation in certain under-resourced languages that are just not done well enough by either open source modules or sometimes paid services. But that's where people can collaborate. I often see prototyping where newsrooms are sort of running into foxholes on their own, trying to make things, and that's admirable. But a lot of this stuff is going to need collaboration, more so than investigative stories, more so than the journalism side of things. The tech side is definitely going to need collaboration. So if you start to work through your workflow and realize there is nothing on offer here for doing a certain task, that's where you can kind of reach out to other newsrooms and start to collaborate around that. Okay, so staying with your story and fleshing out its narrative as it unfolds in real time, this you need your human reporters still to do. Okay, so sitting with a source and understanding their story, okay, that grit is still worth something. Okay, I'm not entirely pro-journalism, so don't get too excited at this point, right? But next is the tricky part, right? Verifying what you're seeing or hearing from this source in time. So this can be done with AI to an extent, but we have seen an onslaught of LLM poisoning, some by accident, some intentional, and you still need to find corroborating sources for what you are trying to report on, right? You're still trying to investigate something. You're still trying to look into something and uncover something new, right? So we may be able to scrape data automatically, but sense checking if the data is correct and worthwhile still demands a human, right? This idea of someone looking at something and is this worthwhile? Does this make sense? And that kind of harks back to the most difficult parts of when any of us have worked on a story, is those moments when you realize, is this story even real? Is this right? And a human needs to come in and kind of make those judgments or kill the story, ultimately, if that is what it takes. But the next step can be done with AI, which is quite exciting, is this idea of reporting against your story. That was something that someone said to me in journalism school a million years ago, and I've always found it valuable, this idea of always report against your story, always try and disprove it. And newsrooms now are building AI systems that attempt to do that. So you have a story, and then they will try and poke holes in your story at every opportunity. But not that that is published, not that that goes out into the world, but that's what helps the journalists kind of figure out if their journalism is any good. So that kind of assistant role is taking more and more of a prominent place in journalism, okay? So checking social media for events or comments that can feed your story, you can build an AI system for that. Okay, now interviewing, this is a contentious point, right? Interviewing a subject to give up the emotion or holding someone to account in a way that, kind of turns the knife on someone, that is something that one of your human journalists will still have to do. But that initial contact is one thing, but maybe follow-up questions, you can create an AI agent with 11 labs and send a voice that sounds much like your reporter to do follow-up questions, right? Like that technology exists right today that you could do, right? So with the consent of the person that you're interviewing, if it's just bits and pieces, the follow-up calls that we've all had to do, you could automate that part of it, right? So if someone is crying and telling their whole life story, do not automate that part. But if it is something more technical, if it's something more finer details, you could do that if you wanted to, right? Okay, so now onto the most controversial part, like writing the article, producing the podcast or the video. This content production is increasingly being done by AI. But at the moment, newsrooms are generating AI content kind of reluctantly, right? But there is with this idea that we are on an inevitable path to how every word is just going to be created by AI generally. There is a malaise I am sensing in newsrooms globally where they feel like, in the end, we're not even going to need to do this. And we still want to do it, but we don't need to. And I would propose a solution to this and to not despair on this, right? So I'm currently mentoring some newsrooms that are building whole AI agentic workflows, right? With AI editors, sub-editors, writers, and they all talk to each other. And sometimes they fight each other. Sometimes they produce good stuff, sometimes garbage. But I would say the product of that AI workflow should not be a final article, right? But bullet point scaffolds with choice quotes and premium points that you allow your writer to write on top of, right? So, because the idea that a story has been uncovered by a human, but then you let the AI produce 50 or 100 bullet points, that kind of makes sense. Because the reason why you didn't at the start want AI to generate the ideas is you didn't want this race towards cliche, right? You didn't want that. And you still don't want that with the final product. So you don't want to do all this work and then hand it over at the last minute to something that might just feel generic. You want to give the people in your newsroom that have that skill the skill to and the opportunity to write that, right? But it's also reallocating that time of where that journalist is now, what their journalist is going to do, in theory, if you are saving that time. Sort of a militant editor would say, okay, well, it takes you 2 days to produce this. Now it takes you half the time. So now you can produce 2 of them, right? That is what I'm seeing a lot of. And what we want to encourage is the fact that, okay, you might have saved a day, but how do you take that day and reinvest it back into the story and make that story better? With all the sort of news gathering and all the things that I've been talking about, actually the stuff where pretty much everyone in this room got into journalism for, we want to encourage people to do that, more of that stuff, right? And that reallocation of time is just as crucial as the tech stacks and the AI and all the stuff with it. Because what I'm sort of seeing is, on the one hand, that intense, like, we just need more and more words. And on the other side, we're seeing people that are just kind of not admitting that they're using AI and just doing less work, right, away from their editors. Okay, so because what you got to think about is we're in a sort of media space where 2 decades ago, we started ramping up the amount of words that journalists need to produce, right? Just more and more words, more Facebook posts, more content. But if we go back to 2006 rather than 2026, then it's worth the effort for writers to write something that might have a spark or creativity. And I know that's easier said than done, but in an age now where you can generate all these words and words with no effort, we have to pick a lane. To try and chase that is just madness, right? Okay, but the reading of your voiceover, the editing of waveforms, I spent way over 10 years moving bits of waveforms around and learning how to use Pro Tools, and that is unfortunately fading. And creating jingles, all those things are also vastly quicker and will get better and better with AI, right? And it's probably obvious that I'm focusing on stories that are more in depth, that are complicated. And this is because the sooner that newsrooms abandon the kind of breaking news, the news that competes with the AI evil overview that we're sort of seeing more and more with, the better, right? I spoke to newsrooms in Eastern Europe and also here in Kenya, where when they have abandoned that model and they're like, okay, we're not going to cover everything that's in a community or every little thing like that, and they've tried to push away from that, they have seen, because that type of traffic is cratering. Once they moved away from that, they're seeing huge success. And it's a hard thing to let go of, because you are probably still getting some kind of traffic, some kind of hits, and you're probably very good at it. But the more you can kind of realize that that competition will always beat you, then the sooner you do that, the better. Okay, so distribution, right? This is where we're all going to have to take a deep breath, okay? The path of the world is leading media to being consumed through like Gemini, ChatGPT, and journalists just feeding these models with their stories in the back end. And no journalist wants this, right? But to a large extent, there is a reality to this, right? It was mentioned earlier and it was sort of shut down, but there is a real reality on how people consume things, and we need to look at that, right? In the same way that anyone who was in magazines or print 20 years ago saw people ignore that and saw the consequences of that, right? And it might not be your whole audience, right? Some of your audience will still want to consume the sort of well-written parts of your journalism, but other parts of it is going to get consumed, and hopefully monetization will be negotiated in that way around your content and data, right? But I am pro journalists finding stories, but this journalism content, this is the key part, isn't going to actually be the most valuable asset that you've got, right? The journalism that, I got a thumbs up from Justice, that's good. So it's not that you shouldn't do it. Everything I've said in the last 10 minutes is about nurturing these journalists more, like bringing back this stuff. But if you're going to make a hierarchy of your data assets, let's face it, let's think of it maybe as a loss leader. And I know that sounds like a cruel term, but the data that those journalists will gather during that process will be very valuable, right? And it's monetization of that in some way that can often be very creative and innovative that everyone needs to start thinking about, right? Because if you have to accept, right, that outside of public broadcasters, maybe you get license fees, Netflix and YouTube are now the global platforms that people feel okay to pay for, right? In most countries now, like YouTube Premium, people will pay $10 for that, but then they'll and ah about $2 to here or there, right? And you need to think about why that is. And it's because those two companies, and I will definitely say Netflix shouldn't fall into this category, but when they survey people, it does. They think of it as a utility, not as content. People think of Netflix as a utility, which is crazy if you've ever spent any time on Netflix, but they have made that jump, right? So if we take that down to a smaller scale in a newsroom setting, thinking of what is a utility that you can use this data asset for is the key to this. This is your exit, right? Not exit of the job, exit of financial strife. Is thinking, okay, Netflix is a utility. How do we make our own utilities? I was speaking to a newsroom in Zimbabwe just 2 days ago, and they specialize in agricultural journalism. Small team, 8 people, very interesting set of guys. And they have recognized the fact that in Zimbabwe, there are these agricultural officers, agricultural extension officers, and they come to farms and they give farmers advice. But often they are not able to get there because of the roads, because of resources, and they are basically leveraging their journalism to create a utility that will replace these agricultural extension officers when they're unable to make it to the farms, right? This is a newsroom that is just producing content at the moment, right? But they have realized that no one is going to pay for their content. But they will pay for this. They will pay for this service that is often lacking, that they're clearly wanting, but sometimes it just doesn't get there because of resources. And I just think that is the most beautiful use case. If a team of 8 journalists basically can start thinking like that, then so can everyone. Okay? But it does kind of start to bring back the question of if we are here for an audience, to service an audience, or if we're here for impact, right? Impact of society, right? And because historically, these were intertwined. The idea that you would sell the content to an audience and that would lead to impact. And these have started to fracture, right? But when an audience isn't paying for the content that is aimed at achieving impact, but for this other utility, then these things can sort of pass each other, right, in the night. And when times get tough, you may find that you service the utility rather than the journalism, right? And that would make you human. Times are tough, money is scarce, people are paying for this thing, they're not paying for that. So it's important when you start to design this, just like the Zimbabwean agriculture outfit, that your audience, your journalism, and your utility are all intertwined, right? Because you don't want to go down the road of the agency model that everyone was pushing, and I fell for like 5 years ago, in that you just end up making sponsored content. And not only is that heartbreaking, it also is not a sustainable business model in any way. Okay, so for the final step in the value chain, you can talk to your audience through AI. And this is something that more and more newsrooms are doing. And it's an incredibly sounds kind of kooky, but it's quite an exciting thing, is you can build a small, even in ChatGPT, a small GPT based on your audience, right? You give it as much information about a sort of premium audience member as you know, and you can speak to that person as much as you want and ask them as many questions as you want. It's a little take home to attempt, because I do think that this kind of experimentation is quite exciting. I'm not saying you should never do a focus group again or never speak to your audience again, but if you want to test something every 20 minutes, you don't want to have to talk to your audience about it. And this kind of creating an AI clone of your perfect audience member can be quite an interesting way to start familiarizing yourself with this kind of thing. Okay, so if you are wondering where to start with all this, my advice would be, instead of making more fast news, I would say that you need to attempt to make slow news faster, right? I would keep your journos pure, right? Don't overpile everything on them like we did with Pivot to Video 20 years ago. And I would allow them to explore things and have ideas as if they're living in the 90s. But then I would invest in infrastructure to automate and speed up every other part of the process. Thank you very much.